Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to our stage the president of PBI, Will Marshall.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I am Will Marshall, president of the PPI, and I want to welcome you to today's forum on enabling the internet, a conversation with America's digital policy pioneers. We have some very distinguished guests here today, people who made critically important decisions for our country, and starting in the 90s and all up to the present. And I just want to start by welcoming our distinguished guest, and who are really going to be the star of the show today. I also want to make an announcement. Unfortunately, Mark Warner, who would very much wanted to be here and be our keynote speaker, has been taken ill and is not going to be able to join us. And is really hurting, and we're thinking about him. We had hoped that Jerry Conley, another great member of Congress from Virginia, would join us, but Jerry's up on Capitol Hill where he's hung up by the prospect of votes. So even though Congress doesn't seem to be doing much, they're doing enough to interfere with our ability to present you a keynote speaker. But the good news is that gives us more time to have the discussion that's really the centerpiece of today's event. So why are we here? Well, look, from the shutdown, the government shutdown, to the botched health care rollout, the news from Washington these days is mostly about political dysfunction. So we thought it would be a refreshing change to talk about something that government got right. And what it got right was cultivating the growth of a new digital economy based on IT and the internet. And the story of how scientists and entrepreneurs and defense contractors and venture capitalists created the technical basis of the internet and the digital revolution is a story that's been often told. You all may have seen a great Vanity Fair piece called How the Web Was Won from some years back. But much less attention has been paid to the policymakers who created the legal and regulatory framework that has enabled the exponential growth of this medium in the last 2 decades. So our purpose here today is to correct that oversight and to remind people that the internet is not just a technological marvel, a tribute to American ingenuity, but it's also a great political achievement. And without the political dimension, it wouldn't be what it is today. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the National Information Infrastructure Framework. Ron Brown, then Commerce Secretary, unveiled in the first year of Bill Clinton's administration. Now, that doesn't sound like a riveting read, I understand, but it did commit the national government to the first coherent policy of support for what was then called, and it has a quaint ring today, I guess, the information superhighway. It was really a seminal and foundational policy document. And over the next 2 decades, this infant internet grew into the World Wide Web, and it's transformed the way billions of people around the world communicate and learn, work, trade, run for political office, mate, protest, plot, and organize themselves into virtual communities. In retrospect, it all seems somehow inevitable, but of course it wasn't. Had we not taken the paths we did, we could have ended up with a very different reality, as France did when it tried to nationalize something like the internet, the Minitel, back in the 1980s. Policymakers back in the early 90s faced some very threshold decisions, basic decisions about who was going to build this information superhighway, how it's going to be governed, what kind of rules and protocols were going to govern it, to what extent should it be regulated at all. And on the whole, they made remarkably wise and visionary decisions to open the regulated telecommunications market to these new competitors, to stimulate private investment in broadband and digital technologies, and to extend this communication revolution to everybody. Now, of course, they drew fire from both ends of the political spectrum. Conservatives complained that government efforts to expand access to the internet were, you guessed it, a war on the web. Liberals demanded a more aggressive regulatory stance to prevent this company from dominating the nascent digital marketplace, or that company. There was always a fear that we were going to enthrall a new hegemonic monopolistic power, and the government had to step in and stop it. But the market kept changing on those hegemonic powers. And the incumbents, business incumbents, who felt threatened by the new digital technologies, also pressed for sterner regulations to lock in their advantages and to keep barriers of entry to the new marketplace very high. But by steering a pragmatic course between the ideological poles and around these interest group obstacles, policymakers showed not only the foresight, but a quality that's even more rare in Washington, and that's humility. Instead of trying to control the Internet's evolution, they let competition set prices and let consumer preferences dictate which technologies, which devices, which services, and ultimately which companies thrived and survived in the new digital marketplace. So we want to honor today those digital policy pioneers and have a conversation with them in which we look backward. Some of this is going to be historical. We want to revisit the key decisions and debates that they were involved in over the past 20 years. And you'll see a very nice digital policy timeline with some of these milestones in the program. But we also want to ask them to look forward and apply what they learned and their experiences to a difficult and, if not daunting, set of new challenges to this open internet. Now, obviously, many of the key digital policy pioneers aren't here today, right? I mean, we had the members of Congress who were the sponsors of the landmark 1996 Telecommunications Act aren't here, and I would say the most significant pioneers of all, going back to the early days, were President Bill Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. They recognized that digital networks were fundamentally different from the old communications systems, and that these networks demanded a new set of policy concepts and tools. If I can be permitted a mildly partisan comment, as one of the fellow travelers back in those years, I think that the Internet's open architecture and decentralized governance is a major, if often overlooked, part of the new democratic legacy of the 90s. And PPI was proud to play a supporting role in the 90s. We launched a new economy task force, which was actually chaired by then private citizen Mark Warner. And it brought together technology entrepreneurs, high-tech entrepreneurs, a lot of them from Silicon Valley, with policymakers in Washington to hammer out new rules of the road for economic policy making. And boy, putting those folks in the same room was an anthropological experiment back in the late 90s. Didn't even speak a common language. But these policies took root in the 90s and were refined and strengthened during the Bush administrations and the Obama administration. And our honorees reflect this bipartisan continuity of policy. I would say that digital policy making is one of the is a rare exception in Washington to the zero-sum logic of polarization that seems to have stymied us on almost every other front. We need to keep it that way. The vibrant innovation ecosystem that has grown up around the internet has become the single most powerful catalyst for creating jobs, for spurring economic growth and maintaining and raising living standards in the United States. A lot of PPI's recent work has focused on the economic value generated here. Michael Mandel's work on 750,000 new app economy jobs generated just since 2007, when the first smartphones really came to the market. This year also PPI did its survey of the companies that invest the most in the United States. What are the 25 companies that make the biggest bets on the American economy? We call them America's investment heroes, and we found that our big telco companies and tech companies, along with a lot of energy companies, dominated that list. So it's a real magnet for private investment. And now we're moving at warp speed toward what Michael Mandel has called the Internet of Everything, the marriage of the virtual and physical worlds, which promises to spread the productivity-raising power of information technology and digital networks to the rest of the economy and get this country back on a high-growth path. But the benefits are not just economic. Ev Ehrlich did a marvelous report for PPI recently, which I think is out there for folks to look at, calling for a progressive broadband agenda. And he noted that, you know, we all hail the empowering qualities for individuals of the internet and digital technology, but it's also a powerful tool for social empowerment, for collective action to solve social problems, and also for political engagement, as we've seen vividly displayed in President Obama's 2 campaigns. So, in short and in sum, continuing to get digital policy right is critical to our country's prosperity and to its progress. So finally, a word of thanks to the many friends and supporters who made this event possible. If I tried to name you all, this would go on longer than the Academy Awards. Nobody wants that. But I do want to single out one person, my good friend Link Hoeing, who helped hatch this idea and who challenged us to tell this story about America's digital policy pioneers. So thank you very much for coming, and if you'll just hang tight, we'll move on with the program.
Today, with nearly 3 billion people online around the world, it's easy to forget that the public internet is only about 20 years old. And it's easy to forget that this amazing digital platform for communication, information access, global commerce, and social networking might not have evolved into the convenient, affordable tool we use every day. Indeed, just 2 decades ago, so much of what we now take for granted wasn't much more than a twinkle in Mosaic's eye. Surely we all remember Mosaic, the first browser most of us would have learned to use if we had a computer back in 1993. It was a time of unprecedented technological achievement, which demanded bold political vision. Would government try to control and overregulate this new economic and social tool? Or would it take a different approach, one that favored private investment and competition? The first answers came when Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown released the National Information Infrastructure Initiative in 1993. This was the Clinton administration's bold vision to turn the Internet into an information superhighway with on-ramps for everyone, through policies shaped by a far-sighted core of digital policy pioneers.
We need to ensure that the national information infrastructure, just like the personal computer, is open and accessible to everyone with a good idea who has a product they want to sell.
In 1996, the Clinton administration and Congress took what might be considered the last act of the analog age and the first act of the digital age.
Again, let me thank you from the bottom of my heart, every one of you, for making this great day for America possible. Thank you.
The 1996 Telecommunications Act marked the shift from enforcing top-down rules to promoting competition among emerging technologies. It was the birth of the information revolution.
This is the first State of the Union carried live in video over the Internet. But we have only begun to spread the benefits of a technology revolution. We have to clearly commit ourselves to making the most of what is clearly the engine of tomorrow's economy, technology. We have to make ourselves absolutely committed to the proposition that we will first do no harm. We will do nothing that undermines the capacity of emerging technologies to lift the lives of ordinary Americans.
The course for the future was set. And over the coming decade and a half, wise policy decisions helped foster an explosive boom in digital commerce, as well as a powerful tool for individual and social empowerment.
If we were to allow a competition to flourish like this, without the regulation that's distorting the playing field of that competition, I think the market would work itself out and we'd have a very rapid growth.
One of the exciting things that we have in the marketplace now is some real interesting competition between the cable operators on the one hand, the telephone operators on the other. And I've made it very clear that anybody who wants to invest in broadband advanced services is going to be able to do so, at least on my watch.
When people say this is not an important technology or it's not something we need to give everybody immediately or people can wait, that's something that is curiously offensive to me, mostly because I know exactly how powerful and important this technology can be if you put it in the hands of people who know how to use it.
We commit ourselves to the same policy formula that is proven to stimulate innovation and bring more choices, better value, and more personalized service to people.
Under the Obama administration, U.S. officials faced new pressures to impose international regulation on the Internet. In 2011, U.S. Ambassador Karen Kornbluh led the charge at the OECD to defend the free flow of information and digital trade across international borders. The next generation of digital policymakers will face a formidable array of challenges, from growing worries about data security and privacy to concerns about global regulations, trade barriers, and taxes. But there's tremendous opportunity, too, as high-speed broadband and smart devices move us closer to the Internet of Everything. It's the marriage of the physical and virtual worlds, and it's showing up everywhere, in our cars, in smart appliances in buildings, and in businesses using big data to make better products and to make them more efficiently. The enabling approach pioneered in the 1990s and continued to this day, policies that put American ingenuity in the driver's seat and sparked massive investment in the Internet, have served us well. And today, a free and open Internet is our most potent tool for boosting productivity and performance in every sector of our economy and putting America back on a high-growth path for tomorrow.
Please welcome to the stage our digital policy pioneers and our moderator for this afternoon, author Larry Irving.
I'll just introduce myself while the real speakers are going to get organized here. And take any seat that you like. I'm Larry Downs. I'm an internet industry analyst based in Silicon Valley. And watching that video, I have to say I was reminded of where I was in the mid-1990s when I was a relatively young internet entrepreneur out on the West Coast, and how I marveled over the next 10 years and more at how so many good decisions were made in the area of internet policy and technology policy. I have to say, speaking for some of us in Silicon Valley, that's not what we expected. So we were happily surprised when the kinds of often very courageous decisions that we just heard about were made, that they were getting done the way they were. So in some sense, sitting with this particular group of pioneers, this is kind of like my Woodstock. So I feel a little intimidated. Let me tell you how we're going to run this, because for one thing I want you to know in advance, but another thing is I expect that the panelists will take it somewhere else. So I just want you to know beforehand that I did have a plan, even if we don't actually get to it. You have their detailed bios. We're not going to go through that, but what I'm going to do is start by asking each of our esteemed honorees here to describe one particular decision that they made in the course of their very long careers, in many cases, that has proven to be extremely prescient and extremely important in the development of the broadband revolution. And they're going to sort of tell us that story for sort of 5 to 7 minutes each. Then we're going to have a little bit of reflection on that. I'm going to ask them to comment on some of what they've heard from each other. And then we're going to move to a future-looking conversation. We have a list of maybe 10 or so topics that are very important today. And I don't know how many of them we'll get through, and more of them are arriving at my phone just in the last hour, so I'm going to keep adding to them. But we'll talk about as many of them as we possibly can. So let me start with Ira Magaziner. We saw how you were involved in this. You were instrumental in shaping the Clinton administration's e-commerce policy, which put in place this largely hands-off approach to regulation of the internet, and it's more or less continued to this day. And I think in particular what I was most reminded of is the decision that was made to turn over what seemed like, in retrospect, maybe not so important, but turns out to be extremely important, was the idea of internet number and naming, which had been under the Commerce Department. The decision was made, in fact, to turn it over to the multi-stakeholder organization, multinational organization, ICANN, which it turns out, as we've seen, at least just in the last year or so, has been a seminal decision in the ability of the internet to become a global phenomenon and to get the kind of network effects that we've seen. Can you tell us about how that decision was made and some of the things you had to sort of fight against in doing it?
Well, with your permission, let me give a little bit of context. So, President Clinton asked me in 1995 to try to come up with a set of policies that he could use where he'd be elected in 1996. And he was calling it the bridge to the next century. And I led a cabinet group to look at a set of things. We met, we listed 10 different things that we look at, and then wound up not following any of them. And instead what we did is we said, look, if you look at the history of economic development, usually there are major technological advances which lead long-term waves of economic development. And in our era, we have three things: the internet, the Human Genome Project, which was expressed in the Genome, and renewable energy. And the internet, we thought, offered the opportunity to really stimulate economic growth in the long term if we got the policy framework right. And when we looked at it at the beginning, there was tremendous potential, but also tremendous conflict going on. Within the first couple of weeks of announcing we were going to try to develop a framework for electronic commerce, I had groups of people from different industries coming and saying, look, we're prepared to put a lot of money in this, but right now there's no predictable environment. We don't know if we're going to get taxed, we don't know if we're going to get regulated, so we're nervous about it. There's also no structure to it. There were internet activists from the Internet Society coming in saying the government should stay out of this, etc. There were members of Congress who said this is ours, we invented it, we got to control it. There were foreign governments saying we're not going to use the internet, it's globalized. And most importantly, there were almost 50 lawsuits, people forget this, from the internet. And so we felt that we had to put a framework in place that would allow us to take off. And the balance we had to strike is that there had to be predictability. So you had to have some structure to it. So it was a predictable place to invest. It couldn't just be complete anarchy. On the other hand, the real strength of the internet is the creativity. It's decentralized. You wanted to allow for that creativity to emerge and not stifle it with regulation over taxes. So to make a long story short, we did a number of different things in the framework. We introduced the framework in 96 and actually was successful in an 18-month period in getting it all enacted, a series of legislation and also treaties that were negotiated. We kept the internet free of tariffs. We kept it free of a bid tax. There was actually proposals in the European Union to impose signatures. We created a legal framework for doing business on the internet. We passed copyright protections that were not too heavy-handed and allowed people to protect copyrights at the same time that there was enough freedom for innovation. We beefed up the security of the internet. One of the first couple of weeks on the job, I went out to look at some of the servers that actually were the internet. There was a bunch of root servers. And I just walked into the University Bay and I could unplug it. And we looked at it and nobody was there to stop it. So we beefed up security a little bit. People who were that's really the internet. And we also made sure that we protected against censorship of the internet, but at the same time gave parents controls to screen out content in more the children to see. It was a more voluntary way than pure censorship. And we feared censorship in the hands of the wrong people around the globe would stifle human freedom. So this was a better way to do it. We protected privacy, but again, did it without heavy regulation. And then the two important things. One is we stopped governments from setting standards for the internet, which would have been the worst thing to do because the marketplace was so creative and so innovative that any standards you set would have been outvoted before you ever got to pass. And so what we said is let the marketplace evolve the standards. And then finally there was the routing system. And this was the most contentious thing. And what we tried to balance there was that we wanted to not have government, the International Telecommunications Union, which is an intergovernmental body, after 10 years of opposing the Internet protocols, wanted to then take it over once the Internet started taking off. I was not very popular in Geneva, but we said, no, we're not going to let that happen. And the University of Southern California was the home to a guy named John Hostelis, and you may have remembered. John was a guy with a long flowing beard and sandals. So I invited him to lunch at the White House once. It took me 3 hours to get him through security. He had at one Internet Society meeting, and they said there were about 1,000 people on the Internet. They said, well, somebody's got to keep the addresses here, keep track. He raised his hand. So he had this little office at the University of Southern California with a contract in Dartmouth, where he sort of assigned numbers and the names to everybody. So if you're Australian, you got the .edu, because John gave it to you. Meanwhile, there was a group in Virginia, Network Solutions, under the Commerce Department, that was in charge of the domain names. They didn't like each other very much. They distrusted each other and so on. So there was a battle waging there. And then you had the international groups who didn't like what was going on. So what we decided to do was to create a new format, which was a private stakeholder-based group that would be international, but would be recognized by governments. And we got the EU and the Japanese and the US and so on to agree to do that. And then it became a different kind of body that could help move at internet speed, but deal with names and numbers in a successful way. Just in summing it all up, we got all these pieces of legislation and all these treaties negotiated in a year and a half, so that every aspect of the framework is actually put into effect. And from my point of view, looking back, I mean, ICANN, which is the body we set up, has been messy at times, and different in the laws always have a little bit of pieces that to be tweaked and so on. But if you look at it in sum total, Internet commerce has taken off dramatically. Those lawsuits went away. People invested. There's been enough predictability, there's been enough freedom, so the innovation has occurred. And so you got to say it wasn't such a bad job that we did, and we got to put all that in place. And it sort of stood the test of time. So I feel very good about it. Now, one of the things I will say in closing is that there are a lot of people who work on this. And I think one of the reasons why it was successful, and it was a lesson I learned the hard way in Washington, given that my first assignment was work in health reform, why it worked out so well, was when I came out of my bunker after the health reform was down, I learned some lessons. And one of the lessons was, President Clinton used to joke with me that I was the only senior advisor in the White House who did not want him to mention in the State of the Union the work he was doing. And the reason for that was because in that environment, it would have politicized it. And instead, what we did is we worked in a bipartisan way. Speaker Gingrich worked with us on some bills at the time. Senator Abraham on the signature bills, and Patch on the copyright bill, and so on. So we had bipartisan groups where we got 60, 70, 80 votes for almost everything we did. And part of that was because we followed the old adage that you can get work done if you don't care who gets the credit. And so we didn't hide what we were doing, but we also didn't trouble because we didn't make a big deal of it. We just got it done, and we worked with all the different interested groups, tried to force consensus, and then had bipartisan support for the treaties and for the legislation we passed, and I think that helped it to survive.
Great, thank you. We'll come back to some of those questions, but let me just move on to Chairman Kennard, Bill Kennard. As chairman of the FCC from 1997 to 2001, you can accurately be described as the first chairman of the commercial internet age. And your work, I think, both before and since then, is really focused on the ability of competition to be a more effective way of regulating than direct regulation. Your tenure, you oversaw some of the most significant mergers that the FCC has had to deal with after the 1996 Act. You encouraged the beginnings of the smartphone revolution. You encouraged infrastructure providers to invest in ways that was going to ensure access for all Americans to the internet. Frankly, it's hard to say what your most important achievement was during that period. My own personal view is it's your draft strategic plan, which I have framed in my office. I still think it's a good plan and perfectly able to take it off the shelf and use it now. But let me ask you, Mr. Chairman, what would you say was the most important policy decision in retrospect that was made by the FCC during your tenure that has led us to the place we are now?
I have to pick one?
No.
I'm kidding. Well, first of all, thank you for doing this. It really is an honor to be here and to be with my colleagues and old friends who fought a lot of these battles together over the years. And I thank PPI and Will for pulling this together. I don't tend to think of it in terms of individual policy decisions. I tend to think of this as a trajectory, a historical evolution of good policy that really began more than 20 years ago. Really, the roots of good internet policy began in the 1980s when administrations at that time at the FCC decided to create an unregulated oasis in the phone network. It was through a series of decisions called Computer 2, Computer 1, Computer 2, Computer 3, that isolated the application layer of the network and allowed it to grow in unregulated fashion. And this was really important because it was done before anyone realized the full potential of the internet. It was done before anybody even knew what the internet was. But it created the framework for a lot of the good policy that followed. And a lot of us at this point can feel that we were pretty prescient at the time. But I will tell you that in many ways we got lucky given the incredible innovation and pace of policy, because things were happening so fast in Silicon Valley in the industry that we couldn't have regulated these platforms if we wanted to, because they were moving so fast. And importantly, a lot of the incumbent industries didn't recognize the importance of this technology. And that is significant because now they do. I think we got the policy right for the most part in the United States. There are still some challenges here. But the rest, the challenges outside the United States, in my view, are more pressing today than ever before. That's why the work that Karen did at the OECD is so important to not only create a framework internationally, but also to make sure that we are selling our policies internationally in a persuasive way and recruiting allies around the world. That is the challenge for this period going forward. But looking back at some of the decisions that I was able to make on my watch, I think that I was most influenced by the failure of legacy regulation, more so than anything else. Because I realized that, one, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, as important as it was in establishing a framework for competition, it didn't go far enough in really putting a stake in the ground that we weren't going to regulate the internet with traditional telephone regulation. And as a result, we're still fighting these battles about whether Title II regulation should apply to the internet. It's in the courts. It is unfortunately casting a shadow over investment in the industry as a whole, because the 96 Act was really all about the analog phone network. It was about the battle between the local and long-distance companies as to who was going to be able to provide landline, dial-tone phone service to the American public. It was the wrong battle to be fighting at the time, and we invested a huge amount of time in working out that regulatory regime. My friend Michael Powell, I think, did an important thing by signaling when he was chairman that we had to think of competition in structural terms and not non-structural terms. This influenced me in the decision that I made not to try to import some of those non-structural regulatory regimes to the cable platform, for example, which I think was one of the more significant decisions that I was able to make on my watch. But it takes continuing vigilance in this sector to remind people, as President Clinton said, the first rule is to do no harm, to have the humility to recognize that regulators have the right answers and can create distortions in the market that cannot even be foreseen at the time these regulations are written. So I guess the most important message that I would give to this audience today is not about the past, but about the future. And that is that many of the experiences that we all learned in the 90s and in the last decade or so are lessons that we have to bring internationally and continue to show the rest of the world the benefits of the policies that we've created here at home.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll come back to, of course, to these future issues. I know we're all dying to talk about them, but let's stick with the past a little bit more. Chairman Powell, you oversaw some also very important decisions during your term as chairman of the FCC, and I think, you know, significantly among others, the move to turn VoIP and Wi-Fi into the technologies that we now know are so central to the way in which the internet works. You also, I think, from my standpoint, most significantly led the Commission during this important decision, very controversial at the time, and in fact some would say still controversial, to not treat the cable the same way as the dial-up internet, and then after that was affirmed by the Supreme Court, to then in fact turn it on to DSL technology, so that in fact we moved away from, as much as we could without rewriting the law, which we'll get to later, from the Title II world to the Title I world. Tell us a little about that process, and again, what were you thinking? What was driving you to those kinds of decisions that you and your colleagues made?
Well, thank you, first of all, for getting this band back together. It's sort of old home week, and it's really exciting. I do think I have to state for the record that unquestionably the most important decision I ever made was telling Janet Jackson to put her clothes back on, but we'll move away from that, talk about this boring broadband stuff. I think with hindsight, you forget the massive amount of both techno-euphoria and ambiguity that was going on at the time. No one had ever seen this before. You know, I'm starting to feel really old when I realized we were still talking about people, nobody had cell phones, no iPhones, no, you know, this dial-up internet thing was just taking off. And it was confusing because, as Bill said, it didn't have a natural place reflected in the organic statutes that we administered. It became more and more increasingly clear that that was the case. Yet, services were popping up all over the country, not only on the architecture distribution side, but on the application side. And I think Ira said something critically important, which was the growing uncertainty of how the government was going to look at this transformation was really getting in the way. I have to say, I was a student of the work that Ira and Karen and others did, and I'll never forget that framework, the first bullet being private sector should lead, and then deeply buried several bullets down is a really important statement about having the courage not to assume that the historic regulatory structure for telephone, radio, and broadcasting should be lightly applied to this thing. It always stuck with me. Do we have the courage to treat something new as new and respect it as not necessarily bringing with it our historical incrementalism, to be honest? I mean, the classic regulatory approach to stuff like this is, oh, we've seen this before. Let's just incrementally extend what we know to this. And I think what I'm proud of, and my predecessor who taught me was proud of, is we had the courage. And you should know, Bill and I had a lot of late nights together around this Portland, Oregon case, I got to tell you. Yeah, and I'll never forget sitting backstage with Bill as he was about to go give a speech, I think at the National Cable Telecom Association.
Great organization, by the way.
Tremendous.
Great leadership.
But you know, him and I talked, we were in a bipartisan way, we spent a lot of time together thinking about this. And we came to a very similar conclusion about the power of trying to create an environment for investment and hands-off and care. I remember we cooked up the phrase, vigilant restraint.
Yes,
I think
right.
we made it up
Remember
backstage, and sure enough, he went up and said vigilant restraint, and that was the policy from then on. But Bill started it, but this point of certainty was becoming a serious issue. And what I inherited was the responsibility to try to do what the global commerce application side was trying to do for architecture. So what was going to be the certainty on the platform side of this revolution? And one of the first ways we approached it was, it's so exciting, but how on earth are we going to get it built? How on earth are we going to create the climate and the incentive environment to ask America's infrastructure companies to essentially rewire, dig up, and go from hamlet to hamlet to bring in this architecture that was going to be phenomenal? You remember at the time, the cable companies had stumbled on it. They had ripped and replaced their networks with high-capacity networks to compete with satellite, to create more capacity for channels. And lo and behold, they woke up and realized, we just invented broadband. But remember, stock prices were in the toilet for cable. The stock market viewed this as a reckless investment on the cable industry's part. They were leveraged to the hilt under enormous financial pressure. How are we going to replicate what they did on a global basis? So we were really driven by, if this dream is going to be as big as people say it is, what are we going to do to try to stimulate that with regulatory policy? The other thing is, we really did think you had to do the hard work of understanding the legacy of Computer 2 and the fact that Congress had enshrined that distinction, and the idea of creating a regulatory classification would let this thing breathe. And in many ways, I think this country's fortunate that cable went first. Because I think if the telcos had come first with broadband, it's very likely you would have followed this path of telephone regulation incrementalism. But the problem with cable was they weren't telcos. They were not regulated by Title II. They presented a regulatory complexity that the phone companies wouldn't have. And in many ways, that was lucky, because that gave us a fresh way to say, wait a minute, they've never been in that category, this is harder. But I think the cable modem order that we decided, with lots of hand-wringing, deep work, statutory work, legal work, policy work, in which we classified it as an information service, was smart. We didn't say it was completely unregulated. We believed that it was an important architecture and the government should have a degree of oversight. We believed it lived in Title I, but we thought the market needed that clarity and needed it right away. And we were willing to say, it is this, dominus ominous. And what people forgot, and Bill started this, is, with all respect to them, we preempted the states. And we finally made clear the internet is an international global architecture, and we are not going to chop it up into regulatory pieces across the world. And I think that almost as important as the information services classification at the time. And from then on, it went forward. And I think in a way that I don't think I could have imagined how excited I would be to see the fruits of that investment. You know, we like to go around saying, you know, that's $200 billion of investment in a decade. We now reach 94+% of all American homes with this architecture. This is in just a decade, and still flying. And I think that's just really exceptional. And then lastly, I would say we shouldn't forget what the work that we all did on Wi-Fi, which I still believe was a brilliant commerce component to the wired infrastructure, which we recognized early on and tried to give life to and get it out of baby monitor category into broadband platform category. And then finally, to sum, I am still very proud of, in 2004, being the first public official to talk about internet freedoms. And while that subject remains somewhat controversial, I think what's controversial is the various contours of the fundamental policy. But I don't think there's any argument about the fundamental importance of an open architecture, an end-to-end architecture, and one that allows consumers to go where they want and do what they want. And if that weren't true, there'd be no Arab Spring, there'd be no Egypt, there'd be no Facebook and social networking. And I think that's really pretty cool.
Great. Thank you. Let's move on to Ambassador Kornbluh. Your resume is remarkable. You were involved in these things from before and since the 96 Act. But I wanted to ask you more about your recent work, because I think there's something that distinguishes you. Chairman Powell hinted at it. Something that distinguishes your work from everybody else. And this was work you did first with then Senator Obama and then President Obama as ambassador to OECD. I think in 1997, very few people would have thought that internet commerce was something that mattered much in the negotiation of international trade agreements. And no one except perhaps you, because that's exactly what you thought. So your focus on technology policy has been largely, if not exclusively, international. What did you see as the risks early on and the opportunities, and how did that early experience influence your activities as ambassador to the OECD?
Well, thanks so much for inviting me here, and I'm really ridiculously honored to be on this panel and also talking to the people who are here. When you say pioneer, I kind of am imagining for myself like the little Laura Ingalls Wilder girl, because I was the staffer to a lot of these people. And in fact, I brought a prop. I showed this to Ira earlier. I was in a room. I worked at the Treasury Department after I was at the FCC, and I was the fourth person in a meeting with Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, and Ira, and this is the memo Ira wrote to them for that meeting, explaining this internet thing.
So what year is this?
I mean, you know, you could write today's headlines from this memo about the challenges that you'd face, about what Amazon was up to. They still haven't turned a profit, as you forecast. But I think these people are a little, I'm just going to say one thing about the panel. I think these people are being really a little bit too humble and implying in the way they're discussing it that they just met the challenge at the time and that maybe anybody else could have done it. But I think you had a particularly talented group of people who had a background that was really appropriate to the time, you know, whether it was being in business, being in media law. Reed Hunt was an antitrust lawyer. I mean, people came to this with an amazing amount of intelligence and dedication to these issues. And what they did, I think, really shows what government can do at its best. And it was very smart and very hard. And one of the things that we haven't talked about is in the 93 Reconciliation Act, that signature bill that was passed to balance the budget by one vote. That's when spectrum auctions were introduced for the first time. And that was another really wise decision of the Clinton administration. I think there are two stories about the Clinton administration's economic success, and one is we balanced the budget and lowered interest rates, and another one is this story that we're telling here. And I think it's equally important, if not more important, as we go forward. Anyway, on to international. So I was at the FCC working under Reed Hunt, who I really want to give a shout out to, and for having not only staffed Al Gore on a lot of these issues, but then having been at the FCC helm during the passage of the 96 Act, and also working with Charlene Barshevsky on the WTO agreement on basic telecoms. And that was a very, very interesting agreement, not only because it privatized telecom service providers around the world and led to independent regulators, but because it had this very innovative approach where it had a set of regulatory best practices that countries could sign on to. And so it led to a great deal of competition and opening up around the world. And a whole international framework that Ira and Bill started talking about was put in place. There was not only ICANN, but the other multi-stakeholder organizations that grew up around it. Europe passed the e-commerce directive, which did a lot of the same things that the US was doing. The US and the EU negotiated a safe harbor agreement to allow data to flow back and forth with some assurances about privacy. And then the OECD, which is this multilateral organization based in Paris, to my good fortune, had these privacy guidelines, and it developed e-commerce guidelines, and these were very much along the same approach as what was happening in the US. Just high-level principles, not top-down, industry-led, light touch. So there was a whole framework that was socialized around the world about how to approach the internet. And what we saw at the beginning of the Obama administration was that the consensus for internet-led regulation was fraying. And you saw it, we tried to categorize it later as there were the cyber autocracies, what Michael's talking about in terms of internet freedom. They wanted to censor, they wanted to control, they didn't like the openness. Then there's this sort of what I've called proto-mercantilist thing going on, where other countries are jealous because they see how successful US companies are on the internet, and rather than seeing the internet as a platform for their companies to innovate, they just see Google coming in and Facebook. And then there are some legitimate, very legitimate concerns that some countries have. How do we safeguard privacy? And then there are the fence sitters, the developing countries that are coming online that aren't sure how they feel about this openness, and they're not sure that they have the capacity to participate in the multi-stakeholder institutions. And so they're tempted by this idea of going back to the ITU, and that's the real threat, is that what Ira kept at bay comes back, and that the ITU gets a hold of the internet. And in Dubai, many people here were in Dubai at the last meeting where it was a very narrow vote not to have the ITU get much more control over the internet, and then the NSA happened. So what we did, I'll just give our story. We at the OECD, when I was there under the Obama administration, building on Hillary Clinton's internet freedom agenda. I didn't know she got it from Michael. But she had this very robust, very brave internet freedom agenda. And she talked about having the same rights online that we have offline. She talked about the right to connect. It was very powerful, and she put her money where her mouth was and her actions where her mouth was in terms of supporting dissident groups that were trying to get online. And then the administration put out a cyber strategy that was also about protecting an open and secure internet. And then at the OECD, we tried to build on that with a set of principles. Many people here worked on that. Again, high-level principles, but this time integrating privacy, cyber, IP. Yes, as a country, you can protect these things, but it has to be in the context of free flow of information. And that leads you directly into what you were talking about, which is there a, how do we go forward on that? Since then, the OECD has done privacy guideline update, and now we're talking about putting it in trade agreements.
And when you first started talking about this in the 1990s, did you find it was hard to get people to engage in questions about international activities in the internet? That now obviously it's clear that it's important, but did you have to sort of fight that battle even within the administration or within the FCC where you were?
I think, I'm not going to exactly answer your question, but I do think that we've had a hard time integrating internet and technology policy with mainstream economic and trade policy.
Yes.
And I think that's a real challenge. And even today, I don't think we have it integrated enough into trade policy. I don't think we have it when we talk about growth. I actually heard a New York Times reporter on the radio a few weeks ago saying, well, the government can't really do anything about new industries. I mean, the internet grew up and the government didn't have anything to do with that. How do we know what the next technology is going to be or what to do? So I think there's this willful ignorance. And if we could integrate those things better, I think we would have a better chance of having more robust policies.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll certainly come back to the ITU. That's one of my future questions or present questions. But let me bring Larry Irving into the conversation. Among your many accomplishments, you're a fellow Northwestern University alum, so we go Wildcats. But we should probably talk about internet policy. Most, I think, notably during your time at the NTIA, you were a fierce voice for, we saw it in the video, for the potential problem or the actual problem that you aptly described as the digital divide. And you said, in fact, in that video that, you were, I think your words were, you were personally very offended that people didn't recognize that as an issue because, you saw the power of this technology when it was put in the hands of people who knew how to use that. Tell us about sort of your moment of recognition when you saw that, in fact, this was a technology that there could be or there was a divide, and why you recognized that that was something that had to be dealt with as quickly as possible.
So let me try to incorporate a lot of what you said. Go back to 1992, and I'm down in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the president has his economic policy group, and I'm tasked to start looking for Ron Brown on things involving the internet, what the Commerce Department might be doing about the internet. At that point, I may be wrong, but there might have been 2 million people worldwide on the internet. When people think about the growth of the internet, 2 million people. By the end of 93, it was 10 million. By the end of 94, I think it was 100 and some odd million. But folks like Laura Breeden helped explain to me the power of the internet. Tom Khalil, Mike Nelson. I'd never been on the internet. When I became the internet policy advisor for the President of the United States and the Secretary of Commerce, I'd never been on it. But I wasn't alone, because nobody I knew had been on it. And I remember going with Ron Brown, and we went out to Silicon Valley. And what we were trying to do was, there was this fear that the president was going to, and the vice president, we haven't talked about Al Gore today. I mean, in all honesty, for 4 years, 6 years, Al Gore every Tuesday morning for 90 minutes brought together Reed Hunt, Assistant Attorney General Bingaman, the head of the NEC, the head of CEA, Laura Tyson, Joe Stiglitz. I mean, some of the smartest people on the planet were sitting in the vice president's office and, what are we going to do with this thing called the internet? And one of the things the vice president wanted us to do was to develop a policy framework. So within the first 6 months of my coming into the job, I was confirmed in June, and by September, we had a template, an agenda for action. Open access, private sector driven, universal service. We looked at all of the things that we thought should be in it, and we didn't do it as a partisan document. We had talked to Republicans on the House and around the country, and brought as many business leaders as possible to what is the right thing for us to do. And the Hippocratic Oath was alluded to. First, do no harm. And we actually, Tom, Mike, and I we were kind of the triplets running around the world on this stuff at the time. Reed wasn't in his job yet. He hadn't responded to hire Bill as the general counsel. Ira was still doing healthcare. So there were the three of us went out, what are we going to do? And we basically said, we're going to do no harm. We're going to come up with a framework. We took that framework and took the 9 principles, made them 5 principles, and those 5 principles we took called the Global Agenda for Action. A Global Agenda for Cooperation, and started having a robust dialogue globally. I go out with the secretary to Silicon Valley because nobody out there trusted us. What is the government doing with this internet thing? You're going to try to build it. We put our framework out, private sector investment first. No, we're not going to try to build it. And I remember going with the secretary to Apple, HP, and then up to Hunters Point outside of San Francisco. And you go to Cupertino and you see these bright, shiny as a penny kids who have these computer labs that Apple has paid for, that there are 8 kids per computer, and they're having all kinds of fun and learning all kinds of things. And then you go to Hunters Point, and these kids have never heard of a computer, have no idea that this thing exists. And I went to school also at Stanford, and I'm like, how can within a 15-minute drive in either direction from Stanford, you have this, in a country as rich as ours, have this kind of dislocation? And that started me thinking. And then, Laura was running a program we had. We wanted to show not just that this was a policy thing. It was really about the people. We tried to take it away from the policy. So what does this mean? The president always talked about putting people first. So let's take the technobabble out of it. And what does it mean? And Vice President talked about the little school kid in Carthage. And the president, as most people don't remember, President Clinton was not on the internet until something happened. Chelsea went to Stanford. And all of a sudden, the internet became much more personal to him. And I remember this internet thing was not as important to Bill Clinton pre-Chelsea going to Stanford as it was post, because all of a sudden, he was staying in touch with his daughter. But looking at the kinds of applications we were putting in schools, in hospitals, in libraries, in emergency vehicles, in police cars during the 90s, that's when I understood this had to be for all of us, or this country couldn't progress the way it was going to. So the digital divide wasn't about just being a black kid from Brooklyn who grew up in the projects. It was about being a policymaker who realized that it was as important for the school kid in Carthage as it was for the kid in Brownsville, Texas, as it was for the kid in Brownsville, New York. But the only way we were going to succeed as a society was for all of us to be connected to this thing. And if you were talking about the kind of economic growth we want to see in Africa and Asia and across this planet, we also were, we were trying to break down some of the privatization and corruption we saw in the global telecom market. And we saw the internet as, I remember having a conversation at one of these global confabs, because we had an Internet Society conference, an Internet Society Development Conference in 93 and 95. And sitting across from a minister from some country talking about his, the telephone network and how it brought this cash in. And I said, dude, you better figure this out, because you're going to be so disintermediated by the internet in just a few years. If you don't get in front of this, it's going to swamp you. And those are the kinds of things we could do. We could show it to them, explain it to them, and really make it, not only is it good for you in terms of creating a new model, but it's also good for you in terms of every minister around the world cares about the same 3 things: taking care of the elderly, taking care of the sick, and educating their youth. And when you say, I have this great new technology, do all of these three things for you, you get their attention.
So that's interesting. I'll stay with that for a second because I'm sure you've seen the latest Pew survey results would suggest that the nature of the digital divide has now become principally elderly versus non-elderly. Does that surprise you?
No.
And so to say a little bit.
It doesn't surprise me. And, you know, when I left government, one of the many things I did was I started a .com with Magic Johnson, which failed miserably. That's another story for another day. But I got to hang out with Magic Johnson and spend Howard Schultz's money. So, you know, it's all good. When you buy a Starbucks, thank you, because that paid for my .com. But one of the things we realized then were blacks and browns and young people were jumping ahead of the internet in terms of wired internet and going to wireless. And if you look at what's really helped squash the internet, the digital divide for people of color, it's disproportionately the wireless revolution more than almost anything else. And we kind of saw that coming. With regard to elderly, it doesn't surprise me that much because we always saw there were certain factors that were going to be more decisive in whether or not you were online. If you were a single parent, if you were older, if you were less educated, if you were lower income, if you were rural. And if you are a rural, elderly, low-income person, it's really very hard, and the products aren't there to get there, and you're not part of the internet revolution, and you're not part of the wireless revolution. So it doesn't surprise me. It means we have to do more, but it doesn't surprise me, and I think we're going to see, you know, I've been a minority opinion in this, but I honestly believe that as wireless devices and ubiquitous Wi-Fi become more prevalent across this country, you're beginning to see more and more devices that really can substitute for laptops. In as late as 2009, during the Obama transition, I'm sitting in a room full of a bunch of guys from Harvard, and they're saying we need to put a laptop in every backpack. And I'm like, you have to reach people where you are, and if you go to my neighborhood in Brooklyn, most of those kids don't have a laptop, but all of them have a mobile device. And if we start spending time in figuring out how to put product and application on those devices, it'll be educational products and platforms, you're going to have it's going to be much more readily, it's an easier way to get them educated than if you try to figure out how to get a laptop in every one of those back. And by the way, if you look at schools now, they're putting a mobile device, iPads in back. We have to stop fighting the last battle and start figuring out there may be things that we don't understand that can fight the battles for us better and do a better job. One last piece I do want to make. You know, we did think about trying, during the 96 Act, about trying to figure out a way to create a safe harbor for the internet. We called it Title VII.
Yes.
And I will tell you that when I went up on the Hill to talk about Title VII, and I was, when
was this?
This was 1995, 96. Okay. So we're sitting in the Al Gore offices, and we're all talking about what can we do. And we came up with this thing, Greg Simon and others were saying we need to do this thing called Title VII. And I'm a Hill rat, and I understand that taking to most members of Congress this concept called Title VII, meaning there's going to be less regulation, was going to get laughed at or yelled at. And yes, I got laughed at or yelled at when I said we're not going to regulate this is going to be this great new sector of the economy, and you should reduce regulation of it. That was not something most people wanted to hear in 1995 and 96. It would have been the right thing to do in retrospect. Nobody was ready for it. 18 years later, I think, with the announcement yesterday from Mr. Upton and Mr. Walden, we're probably going to see something a lot like Title VII conceptually back in the news.
So we'll get back to that. And we have a remarkable brain trust up here, and we want to get your view on several of the most pressing issues in the digital revolution. But there were 2 points that I think came out in each of your stories that I want to underscore and sort of get you to amplify for us a little bit, because it was sort of remarkable that, despite partisan differences, despite sort of generational differences, there were 2 things. It occurs to me, even within the Clinton administration, that was not always the policy with new technologies. I remember the day after those Scottish scientists announced that they had successfully cloned a sheep named Dolly, soon after, a week I think afterwards, President Clinton issued a directive, denying funding to cloning activities in the United States until we could figure out, what this was. It was quite a shocking development, so that's not necessarily the wrong. But what I want to ask you is, what was it about the internet that you all saw in your different capacities and similar time periods, slightly different time periods? What did you see the potential? What did you see as the chaos? What did you see as the uncertainty? What was it about the internet that made it different enough that you were each in your own way able to adopt this first do no harm policy when that, in some ways was quite revolutionary in government? And anyone want to start off? Ira, can I ask you?
Well, I think by its nature, the internet was designed to be a decentralized medium whose true power was that any individual could go on it, and if they could get a following, they could start a political movement, they could start a business, they could do whatever, and it was designed to go around obstacles. So its very essence was its creativity and its decentralized nature. I do want to modify slightly the do no harm, because do no harm didn't mean do nothing, because doing nothing would have resulted in no investment. It would have resulted in a kind of Wild West where, decent folk didn't want to play because anybody could shoot anybody any day. So the real trick was to put in place a set of things that made the internet predictable and kind of sufficiently organized so that people felt comfortable with it, and sufficiently secure so people felt comfortable with it, at the same time that you did not overregulate, overtax it, bureaucratize it, etc. And if there's one thing that I think we were pretty good at doing was to get that balance. And coming back to your point that Karen answered about the international piece of this, part of what we were able to do, and Karen, before we came to Washington, worked with me at my consulting firm for a while, and we worked with the Japanese government, the European governments, Australian government on their industrial policies, as well as working for companies. And so we knew the players and we knew their systems. And one of the things we were able to do back in that period of 97 and 98 was persuade governments. I mean, to me, the most interesting was the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan, which had heretofore never met anything and didn't want to regulate. And we were able to persuade them to leave the internet free of regulation in the way it would normally regulate or stifle it. And then the European Union, to their credit, they started out very regulatory and taxing, but then they came around and so on. So we were able to get a series of agreements in place that globalized the medium fairly early. And that, I think, allowed us to strike the right balance, not just in the United States, but also to strike it globally.
I think you can't, at least during the Clinton administration, you can't underestimate the importance of Vice President Gore. Because when he started talking about the information superhighway, long before anyone had heard the word internet, he was visionary. And not only that, but when he came to government, he made it important to deal with technology. And so for those of us who got jobs in the Clinton administration, it enabled us to recruit some of the best and brightest thinkers from different areas of academia, from law firms, from consulting firms. In fact, many of those people are here today.
Looking for them, yes.
When I became general counsel of the FCC, it was easy to recruit really talented people because everybody knew that for this administration, this was really important. Mm-hmm. And I remember meeting with the vice president at that time, and it was terrifying because he knew so much. And he would ask you questions in excruciating detail about your work at what had been a backwater regulatory agency. And part of you would think, well, you wanted to say, Mr. Vice President, you don't need to know about this stuff. This is not what you should be dealing with. But he cared about it. And he convened people across the interagency to deal with these issues and gave us a lot of cover politically. We were also able to do it in sort of outside of the under the political radar, if you will. In the 2008 political campaign, I remember distinctly when net neutrality became an issue in the campaign. And both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton went to address the Netroots Convention, and each of them were required as Democratic candidates to profess their views on net neutrality. I remember thinking, this is really bad, because it's going to politicize internet policy and it's going to make it much more difficult for people in government to make the right decisions as a result. And it's what Ira was saying, he did a lot of his work outside the glare of politics, and it enabled him and all of us really to do a lot of good things.
You know, I think that I'm having all these weird flashbacks, but
Is that this, or is this the sixth?
yeah. What was amazing back then is I remember I used to sort of giggle at the journalists tripping over themselves in search of the right analog, the right metaphors, the right symbolisms. One day it was a Copernican revolution.
Right.
The next day it was something else. I mean, it was just, you know, E this, or should it be I, or should it be... It really was a crazy period where people couldn't find even the language. And one of the things that I do remember sticking with me was that there began to be this conversation that began to use the language of biology. That this thing had the characteristics of organic material. That is, it was self-creating. It was self-healing. It would create synergistically previously unknown forms, right? And we were the speed with which this was moving allowed us to watch this movie in real time in a way that previous infrastructures never would have. I mean, the phone system in 100 years really is fundamentally the same tin can and string that Lily Tomlin's playing with, you know, on television, with a lot of computers that are doing the processing. But it's fundamentally, this thing was exploding on us rapidly. And you could visibly taste, feel, and see this evolution. And I think this organic metaphor, this sort of like a brain synopsis kind of metaphor that took over, really did humble a regulator. I mean, in a sense, when you say do no harm, it's not surprising to me that somebody got to the Hippocratic Oath, because it really was almost like that this was a living thing. And, you know, you could kill this living thing with the wrong choices. And I think we approached it with a kind of respect and humility, at least that's the way I felt, that I don't think anyone had ever approached the telephone wires or the radio airwaves or towers the same way. And so there was this kind of, wow, look what's happening. Kids in garages are doing things we've never heard of. Please don't go mess that up. Mm-hmm. And there was a perception that if someone tries to go reach, you know, for some telephone-centric approach and dump it on this, you're going to put the fire out. Mm. And I think that was I mean, the beauty is we all got caught up in it, and we all wanted to see that continue.
But
yeah, please.
If I can just to go back to the international component, I mean, the danger is that not everyone is that humble or that willing to cede control. Yeah. And it's very tempting. I mean, I remember when we were doing the WTO negotiations, you know, where we met with the president of the Philippines. You know, we met with some really powerful people, because talking about privatizing your telecom network meant, you know, a big hole in your budget. Yes. And talking about letting control, really, you know, a developing country, allowing this internet thing to come in and wreak havoc, is a frightening thing. And so one of the things we've talked about is how, one of the things I just mentioned before was how we need to integrate, I think, internet policy into economic policy. We also have to integrate it into foreign policy. And I mean, I think the NSA thing has certainly shown us that we can't talk about these things in segmented ways. But even before that, we need to think about socializing this idea that Michael just talked about, and continuing to socialize it, and building these norms and telling people, yes, you can protect certain things that are important to your culture and to your economy and your country, but only as long as you don't kill this precious ecosystem.
What was it more? I'll get to you in a second, but I just wanted to follow up on that for a quick. What do you think has been more important, or equally important? Has it been the internet's potential as a commercial platform, or as a platform for social, democratic, you know, community change?
Well, it's interesting, when we did the OECD principles, where we were trying to rebuild this consensus, we decided to sell it as economic. That if you want innovation and economic growth, you need this platform. And here are the kinds of principles that are necessary to allow this platform to come into your country and spur innovation and economic growth. But we never let go of the human rights language as well. I don't think you can.
Larry, did you want to?
Yeah, I want to go back to 92 and 93 again.
Please.
Because that's when we decided we were going to try. You have to remember the political context of 92 and 93. First of all, nobody knew what this internet thing was. I mean, Laura is sitting in, she'll remember coming into my office and explaining to me what the architecture of the internet was, and nobody had a clue in terms of the FCC, on the Hill, within you go to the U.S. Telephone Association or CTIA, and they had no idea what this thing was. We in government were helping to explain to some of the industry players in Washington what this was, and we're doing it globally as well. But a second thing that was really, really important was the political context of who Bill Clinton and who Al Gore were. They came in as new Democrats. They came in as non-reflexively regulatory Democrats. And it was important for them that we not, particularly for Vice President Gore, who really, I think more than almost any policymaker I've ever seen, understood what this meant, that we not kill it, not destroy it, but not destroy his or the president's credibility with regard to being leaders domestically and internationally. If we come in with a reflexively regulatory agenda, we would have lost industry support. We would not have been able to convene the kind of, it is great when Silicon Graphics, who none of us think of anymore, but Ed McCracken is willing to go with Larry Tisch, who's willing to go with I guess, was it Allen or Brown, whoever was heading AT&T, and all of them were willing to talk about, with the vice president, about the importance and power of this internet for America on a variety of reasons, whether it's economic or whether it's social or societal or whether it's cultural. And one of the things that's most interesting, I think, that we also think about is we understood we had a cultural and economic advantage if we could get this right. That nobody on the planet had the opportunity. No one else had a Microsoft. No one else had an SDI. Nobody else had an HP. None of these powers in Silicon Valley, no one else had that. And so we wanted to make sure that we were suitably, to use the word Michael used, and I never use it about myself, but we use it, humble. We tried to be suitably humble in terms of the way we approached this. We didn't want to frighten off the rest of the world. We didn't want to frighten off industry, and we wanted to make sure that the new regulatory paradigm that the president was trying to promote across all of his different political activities was reflected in what we're doing with the internet.
So that was the second thing that struck me in all of your opening comments, and indeed just now, is how many times you've used a word that I don't think gets used very often in the District of Columbia, which is bipartisan. Many of the decisions that were made, even if it was under a Democratic administration, it was with Republican support. And I remember, in the early days, the people at EFF were working very closely with the Speaker Gingrich, and it really started out. The internet really started out as sort of a nonpartisan is probably the better way to think of it. Is that the way in which you came out on these issues wasn't easily predicted by your party affiliation. We might agree on this, we might disagree on this, but it was not likely to be because I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, or either one. And in some sense, that has continued. There are many issues in internet policy, thinking of the response to the ITU conference, and indeed the fight against the SOAP and PIPA copyright regulation. It wasn't necessarily uniform, but that there were Republicans and Democrats on both sides. And the party affiliation wasn't what was really driving it. What can we sort of looking at other issues that have clearly don't have that luxury of having real discussion, real conversation, real nonpartisan. What was it, or what is it about the internet and broadband and the internet revolution that allows us to often, if not frequently, cut through partisan gridlock?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I'd make 2 points about that. First of all, it grew very fast, and it snuck up on people in this town. But the second point I would make is it's getting harder now. Everything is harder in Washington to do on a bipartisan basis these days, and the internet is not immune from that. You have issues around which there was either no politicization previously, or there was bipartisan support, and that coalition has frayed, whether it's around net neutrality issues, whether it's around internet taxation issues, whether it's around cybersecurity issues. These issues are becoming increasingly partisan, and that, I think, is a danger to what we all in this room cherish, which is the ability of this town to come together and make the right solutions for technology and the economy. And I think that's what we really need to be focusing on, and PPI and others who have been active in this area, I think, have a real important role to play, not only in telling the story, but also in educating policymakers today about the importance of coming together and working together on these issues.
So what is it that's been fraying that model and leading it to become more partisan that we can avoid?
Well, I don't know. I think that in part because the internet has become such an important platform for politics, raising money around politics, interest groups, grassroots organizations. It is a convenient drum to beat for people who want to try to use internet policy for political means that, frankly, we didn't have to deal with. I think it's harder for policymakers now to avoid the difficult politics of these issues now.
Chairman Powell, do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, I agree to an extent, but my caution would be not to confuse a dysfunctional Congress, which is seemingly dysfunctional on everything in this way, with what I would call the greater community of thinking around the internet, which I still find a much happier, healthier environment to work on, with less screaming and more thoughtfulness than most things I could be working on. I mean, I could go out to lunch with any of these folks and we'd probably agree 70, 90% of the time. So I would still argue that I think a lot of the thinking in this space still maintains some balance, I think is useful. I also think sometimes you just have to accept exceptional circumstances. I mean, Bill alluded to some of them. Don't forget, late 90s, it's like a drunken frat party going on. I mean, I will never forget the cover of it was a drunken frat party. You know, I remember seeing the cover of Time magazine. Was sort of this, is everybody getting rich? Question mark. I mean, this thing was amazing, right, for this bloom-led period. And I think that's one of the struggles with bipartisanship today. I think economic prosperity brings calmer activity, more willingness to open compromise. And I think when a country is stressed economically, those divisions become more intensified. I think we benefited that we were making these judgments, in my own opinion, in a period of pretty booming prosperity. And to give credit where it's due, with a president who I think had the right outlook about this, both in terms of budget policy, investment in the economy. You know, at the end of the 20th century, when everybody's doing retrospectives, you know, President Clinton is in the film Commanding Heights, along with Larry Summers, talking about the real victory of the 20th century is not democracy, it's capitalism. I mean, there was a unified belief in markets, capitalism, so that was a very strong and fortunate thing. The other thing I think that is underappreciated is there was a arrival of a new class of capitalists, many of whom also were represented by Democrats out of California, for example. So you have this Silicon Valley contingent that rises, and I think is a very unique community in lots of ways. Sometimes over-glorified, but sometimes deservingly glorified, but are, you know, money-making capitalists like the rest, but with a different kind of sensibility around social institutions, I think, to a degree, and that impact has flowed across lots of America and corporate America. And I think that was a cultural thing that came in with the internet as well, to the good. And I think they helped, frankly, giving credit where it's due, shape the way people interacted with it.
Can I just, again, I think people here are being a little too humble. I mean, I saw each and every one of you reach out across the aisle, leave some of your most cherished ideological desires on the table in order to strike agreements. And I think there was this sense that there was something bigger than any ideological point of view that had to be embraced. I mean, I remember working on the E-rate. Al Gore had said we had to let a little girl from Carthage, Tennessee, be able to read a book in the Library of Congress. And so Reed Hunt said, would you figure that out to me? And so we worked with Apple and a bunch of other folks and went to Senator Snow. You know, that was the first. We went to Senator Rockefeller and we went to Senator Snow. We weren't just going to make that a Democratic initiative. And, you know, when it was all said and done, it was a bipartisan achievement. And that, you know, I think things were seen, there was a very important goal and there were very important principles at stake. And so I think people were willing to leave some of their emotions at the door.
Larry, did you want to comment?
Three really quick points. One, there weren't as many stakeholders. You have to remember, the biggest thing, there weren't the kind of money-vested stakeholders in the fight. Two, Silicon Valley wasn't just non-interested in Washington, a lot of folks in Silicon Valley affirmatively disliked Washington. We had to go out there and kind of...
You're putting this in the past tense.
Well, in the 90s, and it may still be true, but in the 90s we had to drag them in. Now they all have folks here who do stuff, and they, they have their Republican lobbyists and their Democrat lobbyists, and they try to figure out who's going to make what mischief for the other side. But you really didn't have that at all. If we wanted to hear from Silicon Valley, we had to go out there to see them or bring them here. They weren't playing here. And we remember the late 90s, early 2000s when they started beefing up and staffing up. Microsoft, which isn't really Silicon Valley, is one of the first, and they all now have tens of millions of dollars of expenditures on this. But the third, and I think...
And so you're saying that's not necessarily a good thing?
That's not necessarily a good thing. It lends to the increased toxicity. People play to, they will poke at the wounds to try to, for political advantage. I was in New York talking to a former senior lobbyist for a major technology company who started as the senior lobbyist when it was a very small technology company. Said he got out because he just didn't, they were a small kind of happy company trying to grow. It was fun. And then when he had to kind of become a bomb thrower for political purposes, it became a lot less fun. Now, since he was there pre-IPO, he could leave and be very happy the rest of his life. We don't all want that necessarily that benefit. Today was instructive. But I think the third thing that's really important to remember, telecom until very recently was nonpartisan across the board. It was more geographic, where you'd have a situation where an Ed Markey and a Tom Bliley would be the other side of, or Ed Markey and Chip Pickering might be on the same side, and Tom Bliley or Billy Tozan and John Dingell might be on the same side. I mean, it didn't break down on ideology, it broke down on geography. Who are the companies in the district going to benefit or lose based upon what you were doing? That doesn't exist anymore either. It's much, you don't get, when we did the Cable Act of '92, which, whether it's good policy or bad policy, and Michael and I could have that debate, it was Jack Danforth and Ed Markey. It was Billy Tozan, who was somewhere between Republican and Democrat in those days, still a Democrat, but leaning toward Republican in a lot of ways. I mean, it really was a nonpartisan, bipartisan effort to pass that bill. That couldn't happen today. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think if you could take the partisan politics out of technology policy, it'd be better for
which is that these OECD principles that we just did, we had agreement, across the board, from Google and Verizon to Disney and Vivendi. We had the technology community, and it was. I think it was because we saw a threat from the ITU, and then we just went high level enough so that we could get agreement, because we knew agreement was the most important thing.
Yeah. I would say one thing, though.
Please.
I agree with everything that's been said here, but you have to remember, even in that 97, 98 period, I mean, there were people who were trying to impeach the President of the United States. This wasn't all kumbaya and everybody happy and so there was a partisan atmosphere that was pretty ugly if you were sitting in the White House, where it was, because people were trying to impeach him. And there was other things going on that were equally not so nice. And so in that environment, though, and this is why, again, I'm not in Washington now, but I don't see it as much now. You still, and the president, I think, exemplified this president, he still, there are people who are trying to get him thrown in jail or impeached. And I would go to him, I'm going to go see these guys because I think they're going to support us. And he'd say, sure, go do it. Let's, I mean, he could separate what they were trying to do to him from, hey, this is a good piece of policy, let's try to get it done. And on their side, the Republicans, I remember when we invited them to the White House we did 2 events to announce some of those events. And Barbara even spoke at one of them and hosted the dinner. And they initially were suspicious, when I invited them and said, well, why is he inviting us? Because but they came, and he acknowledged them, and so on. And so that type of thing didn't happen in an environment that still was pretty toxic and ugly if you were sitting in the White House. And I don't know why that's not happening today on some of these issues. And the thing that made it happen then was not, okay, I got this guy in my district. It was the people we were talking to thought that there should be bipartisanship on something that could really grow the economy. And the ideology was out of it. It wasn't an idea. I was somebody that initially, when I started working with Jeff Eisenhower at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, was a supporter of what we were doing, and others did. And they actually said, okay, on this, we're going to put all that stuff aside because this has tremendous economic growth potential. And it wasn't ideology. It wasn't about ideology one way or another, or about trying to score political points. I don't know why we don't have that ability today, because the environment is toxic, but not more toxic when we actually try to impeach the president.
I think Ira's mentioned it, and Larry did a good job mentioning it. I think it's hard not to remember that Americans love the sense of manifest destiny. This thing, at the time, this had recaptured that imagination. This was the grandeur of America. It's great innovation capital of the world, the leading economy of the world. Remember, at the end of the 21st century, the United States was sitting globally pretty. It was considered the world's leading empire and one of the greatest to ever, and this thing played into that narrative quite beautifully. And the reason I think it's important to remember, it is just as important today as sitting at the pinnacle of whether we're a great empire in the 21st century. To me, the internet is just as critical to whether my kids will enjoy that prosperity that I enjoyed as I did back then when it was clearer. It's murkier today. Yeah. But I still don't see a path to the kind of glory that Americans relish in for their nation without it. And so it better get back to being bipartisan, and it better correct itself in some way in a global environment, or we're going to regret it.
All right, so let's shift gears in the time we have left. Let's talk about the future, because you're all sort of scaring me, which is good. I think that's what we wanted. I have a long list of sort of current problems in technology policy, but rather than go through them one at a time and ask you what you think of them, let me ask you individually, and we'll sort of go this direction this time. Wow. What's the one thing that's keeping you up most at night when you think about the future of the internet? Is it spectrum? Is it IP transition? Is it international ITU? I
don't have one, but so I'll give you the top three. Spectrum.
You always have three.
I always have three. Spectrum in the United States, but also globally, is going to be a problem. We are incredibly dependent upon spectrum, and we do not have I don't believe, the right framework for getting spectrum in the most productive hands. And so I think that's important. I think figuring out the regulatory model that's going to give some type of certainty to investors, but also ensure that our historic commitment to certain principles is maintained, is going to be difficult, because those who care about the investment don't necessarily care about the principles, those who care about the principles don't necessarily care about the investment. And trying to get those two things balanced is very important. And then the international piece. I mean, when you go off, and I've been doing this for 20 years internationally. I mean, I remember my first conversation, which was in a bilat with the Japanese, and thank God the next week was a bilat with the Brits, because the Japanese, to Ira's point, were like, we're not having it. And there was a guy, Don Cruikshank in Britain, who was one of the real, all the stuff we're doing, if we don't talk about Don Cruikshank at some point, we're just missing it. Because Don Cruikshank, what he did in Britain with regard to privatization and creating a framework for policy, you have to look back at those guys. And unfortunately, there were more folks like the Minister of Japan in 1993 than there are Don Cruikshanks around the planet. And this is a global revolution. If we don't have some kind of global comity on this, we're going to have problems in terms of watching this technology do all that it could do for all the people it could do it.
Well, unfortunately, many of those Japanese ministers are now state legislators in California. This is the problem I have to deal with. Ambassador, what do you?
Yeah, I would definitely say that I feel that the internet's at risk because of what's happening internationally. That the people have focused on what happened with the NSA, but I think that just threw a lit match in what was really a very brittle pile of jealousies and concerns that people had. And we really need a foreign policy of the internet that not only deals with, as I said, the cyber autocracies, but also deals with this mercantilist jealousy that people have, and that really enshrines this idea of free flow of information. And then we really need a digital development policy that goes to the developing countries and helps them in some of the ways that we dealt with digital divide here, and gives them a stake, both in terms of the fact that they can see that economic growth, that they can see the benefits of having the internet, but also that they have the capacity to participate in the multi-stakeholder organizations. And those multi-stakeholder organizations are becoming less American, but that means we have to how are we going to make sure then that they safeguard the values that we all care about? Well, we have to we have to really work on building up the capacity of folks to keep those going so that we don't wind up, as opposed to de-Americanizing the multi-stakeholder process, losing it completely and seeing it gobbled up by the ITU, and then we lose this end-to-end single open internet. So I'm pretty scared about that, and I think we really need to focus on it.
Okay. Chairman Powell?
Well, I think the internet's a beautiful thing, but I think it's important to remember it has Achilles heel. And I think the thing that I'm worried about are the cyber threats and the backdoor failings of the internet. The internet has brilliance in its architecture, but it has very serious vulnerabilities as well. As the internet has matured and we have really moved an enormous amount of our citizenry on it, and we've told them to trust it and to rely on it, and now, we're not just looking at little cat videos, but my banking is sitting there, my children's health records are sitting there, my birth certificate, my social security number, which the government will not let me replace ever, is sitting there. The target for both criminal enterprise, damage, personal harm are rising. And I worry, and it isn't just a regulatory problem, it's an engineering and architectural issue. It has those seeds of its own vulnerability. If the consumer ever loses faith in the reliability of the trust of the system, you could have a very precipitous collapse in a way that I think worries. The other amazing question along the same sort of line is, will the world, and the world is important on this actually, but America for the most, will it renegotiate what privacy means? Mm-hmm. And I think privacy is a very ephemeral concept to a lot of people. It's evolving, it's gyrating, but there's vast, massive footprints being made of all of us. And I always worry that one day, right, there'll be this breach we never saw coming, this exposure of your life in a way you never saw coming. Google servers get ripped apart, someone goes in there and gets everything, and it's an utter disaster from a privacy standpoint. And I think that's something to constantly be worried about.
Okay. Chairman Kennard?
I agree. I would wholeheartedly agree with what Karen said about the new frontier being international. I just came back from almost 4 years in Europe, and I had to spend 18 months of that time convincing the incumbent European telecom operators not to oppose our position on multi-stakeholder governance at the ITU. Mm-hmm. This is Europe, our closest ally. And for many people, not only in the rest of the developed world, but also in the developing world, they look at our success as a transfer of wealth from them to us. Mm. And we are an easy target. I can't overestimate the harm that these NSA revelations have done to our ability to make these arguments internationally. And our companies are increasingly vulnerable because it's unlikely, frankly, that the national security agencies here and around the world are going to change materially what they do. But the scapegoats and the victims are going to be our best companies in America. Everyone who relies on cloud computing as central to their business model, which is ultimately going to be everybody, but they're going to get whacked. And when I go to these international meetings, it's amazing to me how few American companies at high levels are really engaging. At the Wicket last year, where we suffered, let's be frank, we suffered a big defeat in Geneva at the Wicket. And there weren't that many companies involved. Kathy Brown, who was my chief of staff and was at Verizon, she was there. AT&T was there. But there was not high-level involvement from key American companies. We're losing this battle. And I tell you, the EU is quite inclined right now to start building a wall around the EU when it comes to transfer of data. We've got to focus on this. It's really urgent.
I agree with the two issues that are raised as being the most important ones. Let me, and that is getting the international agreements right, and then secondly, this whole issue of privacy and as it translates over to security. And we work, I spend almost all my time now in the developing world because I'm running President Clinton's foundation activities around the world, more than 40 countries in Africa and Asia and so on. And I can't tell you how much damage has been done to America's image. First by things going back to Abu Ghraib and things that came out of the extremes of the Iraq War and how that changed the perception of America as a defender of freedom. But now these revelations of the NSA and spying. I think the way we approach this has to be respectful of particularly the large developing countries, the Indias, the others, Indonesias, who are going to play a more important role. And I think we can't just sort of trample over them. We can't sort of ignore them. And I think the best strategy, when we did ICANN, which you asked about in the beginning, what we did was to say, look, the best way for us to get the kind of global internet we want is not to try to hold tight control of it as being ours. Because if we do that, it'll be rejected by the others. But if we open it up and use our persuasion and structure it in a way, then we can help others see that this is the best way to do it, and that's what happened. I think we have to do the same thing in our negotiations now. We have to understand and respect what the developing countries in particular are trying to get at. We have to respect the concerns of privacy that the European members have. It's scary stuff, right? And we have to be a bit for ourselves now in reformulating the way we're going to form our policy to negotiate with them. And so I hope that we're going to be wise enough to do that over the next couple of years.
Well, we will be wise enough to do it if we have people like you continuing to advise us on these issues. I have 4,000 more questions. I'm going to stop, however, now. I'm going to turn it back over to Will, but I want to personally thank the panelists, these pioneers, not only for the work they've done, but for these great insights this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Good job. Well, thank you very much. Let's give Larry a great hand for a wonderful job of steering the conversation. That really was a rich conversation. Thank you all so much, and particularly this last section has helped crystallize for PPI what we ought to be focusing our policy work on. So we'll take that back with us. Before we release you from captivity, though, we do want to give you a token of our appreciation and esteem for what you've done. We racked our brain. What sort of award could we give you? And my original suggestion for coonskin caps was rejected. And then we tried to think about what a virtual Oscar would look like. But we do have these things, which this is Sloan Hurst's inspiration. I really like them. And they are, this is a language I don't speak. It's binary code, but it says Digital Policy Pioneer on it. And we just want to give each of you one of these, ask you to come up, get your picture taken. You know the drill. But honestly, these folks, I know Ira had to interrupt travel to Africa as part of the important foundation work he's doing to be here today. Bill out of town and others, and Karen off apparently her deathbed. Thank you all for making the time to come out and join in this conversation. It's been very inspiring to me. I only wish the inveterate haters of government could have been in the audience today to sort of hear this and see the caliber of the public officials we have in this country at their best, and who are making decisions that are full of integrity and wisdom and intelligence and hugely consequential for all our lives. So enough speechifying. Let me now just ask you each to come up. Ira, if you'll come up first, we'll get some pictures and hand each of you this mysterious award. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
It starts buzzing. I'm going to give
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. All right, Bill, your turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
There'll be an award for the person who comes up for the name of it.
The Michael.
Michael, thank you very much. Very nice. Good to be here. Thank you. Karen, I know I can't touch you, so I'm going to Just hold it here for you. Thank you.
We got to get together, Chad.
Thank you.
And
It's
Larry,
beautiful.
just in time. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We now have a reception right across the hall, right? So please join us. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the show.
This will be